Good morning, Landon. I'm going to wait just a little bit. I know I started a little bit late. For some reason, I couldn't get everything to connect. It was very annoying, needless to say, because I said I'd start at 10:30. Although as I look out my back window right now, I have never seen, ever, a squirrel lay flat, like belly flat, on our back fence. And it concerns me that maybe he's just sleeping and sunning himself, or maybe one of the dogs gave him a heart attack. I don't know. It's very odd. Oh, now he's up. That's good. All right, so I've got 5 of us here, and today I have 1, 2, 3, I have 4 pages. And please know that if you need to go anywhere, do anything, that you can always watch the videos later. But I have the paper that I gave you as practice on Wednesday that I said I would go over today. And then I have a number of Knowre questions that I wrote up. And that way you'll be able to go through some of them. I will tell you that the end of 9.696 you won't see till next week. So that's why the due date seems to be so far off, and that is because I don't want us to have to stress too much about those questions. Yes, Mr. Colahan, there are 4 pages of examples. I'm doing this for both the honors geometry and algebra 2 because I missed their practice session this morning. So yes, thank you. Make sure when you're looking at these, we are going to go back and forth between sides and angles so that you're able to probably get through most of those 2 Knowre assignments. I think it's 9-6, the last 5 or 6 of them have to do with angles of elevation and angles of depression, and we'll talk about that next week. So let's go ahead and get started. If you have questions, make sure you type them into the chat. Remember, there's a 20-second delay. If not, I'm just going to keep moving forward. So our first one, we want to check for X and Y. Let's go ahead and work with X first. Remember, they give us this number here. That's the one we want to use as our reference angle so that we know where we're going to be when we put in our opposite adjacent. And then, of course, we know how hypotenuse isn't going to change. So opposite here is X. Hypotenuse won't change. And down here is adjacent. Now, because we are going to look for X, that's our opposite. That's the one we want to work with. And the only other value we have is hypotenuse. So I'm not just randomly choosing a trig function. I'm using what values are part of my formulas. And opposite and hypotenuse go with sine. So when we write sine, we put our angle right next to it. Our ratio, x over 42, because it is going to be opposite over hypotenuse. And we've created this equation that we have to solve. Remember that stored in our calculator is what the ratio in decimal form for sine 15. Again, making sure when you go into your calculator, you have the degree mode set. And we're going to find that decimal. Remember, again, that is actually the ratio. It's in decimal form. And we're going to write out a couple places just to keep track. Not really rounding anything, and I do write it as a ratio just to stress the fact that that's really what that decimal means. And because it's equal to x over 42, what this side is, that's actually what this side should come out to be. That's what an equal sign means. So to solve, we've got our proportion. We're going to cross multiply and solve. What's nice here is there's a little work. 1 times x is x. And then because I've kept all my decimal places in my calculator, I just have to push times 42. And I have found that in your Knowre problems, you are going to want to round everything to the nearest hundredth. Every question I've read says round to the nearest hundredth. So make sure you go to 2 decimal places, and that is going to stay 8.87. So we found X. Now what we need to do is we need to figure out what Y is. We're going to change not the reference angle, just what values we're using. So this time we have adjacent, but we're still going to deal with hypotenuse because that's the only value that they've given us. And now adjacent and hypotenuse match with our definition for cosine. So cosine 15 is adjacent over hypotenuse, and now the steps are going to be the same. Nothing's going to change except what button we push here. So cosine 15, again, just a few places to keep track that it's a ratio, and because I'm not going to take anything off of my calculator, when we cross multiply, 1 times y is going to stay y, and I'm just going to push times 42 in my calculator. I did play around with, real quick, just take a look, 8's there, so that's going to bump that up to 7. If you don't write enough decimal places down, or you don't use your calculator appropriately, Knowre will count it wrong if you don't round correctly. So you could do everything right, but you don't round correctly, and it will tell you you're wrong. So make sure you are careful with that. So we're going to change gears in number 2. Notice the difference on this one. We had an angle measure given and only 1 side length, 2 unknowns. Here you have 2 side lengths given, so they're asking specifically for our angle. Nothing's going to change on how we set this up. We just have to locate BAC, so that's this guy right here. Here's BAC, and we want to then label with just what we have that this side is our opposite and this side is our adjacent. I did forget when I drew this to make sure that that was a rectangle. When we have our opposite and adjacent, the only trig function that's going to match with that is tangent. So this time, and to make my life a little easier, I'm going to make that theta so I don't have to write BAC next to our tangent. So tangent of our angle BAC, or theta, is opposite 16 over adjacent 10. Now remember, we have to undo tangent to get theta by itself. So when we do that, make sure you remember that we have that inverse operation that we have to, what we do to one side, we have to do to the other. Now, most of this is just for notes. Very rarely are you going to see anyone write all this out. It is all done in your calculator, and that's where you have to, again, look at above the tangent button because we're using tangent, so second tangent, and again, use the division sign. That way when you have decimals and fractions, it does work better. And then round your nearest answer, again, to the hundredths. And in this case, it's a 4, so we're going to have about 57.99 degrees. And we're done. That one only asked for 1, so we only have to worry about 1. All right, the last one that I gave on Wednesday for us to look at, we want to find both angles. We talked about when you find 2 sets, when you find 2 sides, the work's a little bit longer because you have to go through the process twice. The nice part about finding the angle measure is if you're confident with the first, the other one is just its complement. So if I'm going to look up here at angle L, again, this reference angle tells me we have opposite and we have hypotenuse. And those two numbers, again, if you can't remember, SOHCAHTOA is a good mnemonic device. So we're going to use sine. Sine L is opposite over hypotenuse. And this time, I'm not even going to write all that out. Just kind of pay attention first. You can see how fast this goes. L will be approximately second sine 18 divided by 23, and you get your answer of 51.50. And I will say, if it says round to the nearest hundredth and it's a 0, still put that in, or it will be wrong in Knowre because this place value they have specifically asked for. So keep that in mind. So again, we applied, and some of us might even like the process where you just kind of tack on inverse sine each time. That's a way to look at it. Now when we go to do angle N, the measure of angle N is just 90 minus that 51.50. And when you do plug this in, again, make sure if this was a Knowre question, it does say round to the nearest hundredth. Put the 0 there because it wasn't an exact 0.5, it was a rounded. So those are the three we did on Wednesday. Again, if you have any questions, type them into the chat. I wanted to make sure that we looked at the process because here are some questions that are a little more involved from Knowre. Remember that they might be the same questions, they might be questions similar, but the process will still be the same. So I thought these questions were kind of interesting. In number 16 in 9.5, it says use the trig ratio to write an equation that can be used. So it doesn't actually ask you to solve anything, it just wants you to write the equation. That's what we're actually doing in each of these. We're writing an equation out in order to solve. So this is what it looks like. If I wanted to solve for the measure of angle G, what that is that's us undoing cosine, making that inverse cosine appear on both. When that happens, we know that those two are going to cross out. They're going to cancel each other out, leaving us with what would be inverse cosine, and then in Knowre you would put the fraction symbol, and then you would make sure that you did 9 and the radical symbol 2 over 15. And that's all we want. There's no answer, you're not finding the measure, you're writing the equation. So that's something when you look at what does that mean, it wants us to show the inverse function with the fraction. Number 18, it says write the inverse trig equation that uses the given measures to find the measure of angle O. So if we approached it the way we've been with solving everything, we'd find our reference angle, we'd label opposite, adjacent, hypotenuse. We would have to choose, of course, the correct trig function. We want to make sure that we're looking at which one works with adjacent and hypotenuse, and that's cosine. So we would start by writing cosine of angle O would be 3 radical 2 over 5. If we're writing the equation, what we're trying to do is, again, just like you saw on our practice from Wednesday, we're looking to apply that inverse cosine to each side. And it didn't ask us to actually go to the calculator and solve this. What it wants is for those cosines to cancel, leaving us with what we would actually just plug into our calculator. So that's what we would look like. And I don't like when they do O's in triangles, it looks like zeros. So the measure of angle O, this is also the exact answer. It will be something later in pre-calc that a lot of times you'll see they'll leave it like this so that they can use identities and properties. But that is the exact value. Anything after that will have to be rounded. So first two I thought were interesting just because it didn't actually ask you to solve, and that could probably be confusing for some of us. Now the next one, I obviously have cut back on some of the words that are used, but we want to use the trig equation to find the measure of angle Q. So now they just want to find the answer. So all that other work that we've been doing, that's what we're looking for. So again, in order to find angle Q, we're looking to do the inverse sine of that radical 5 over 5. And here's where I suggest, because you're going to start getting radicals, they want all these exact values. When you do inverse sine, it opens up this parenthesis, radical 5, and close the parenthesis. I would be concerned that it's going to divide by 5. So make sure, put in enough parentheses that you keep it separate. So now we have a lot of parentheses, but the whole radical divided by 5, which is what that says. And then we have our answer of 26.57 because that number after. So the measure of angle Q will be approximately 26.57 degrees. So make sure when you're plugging it in, now you could also figure out what the square root of 5 is. Notice I pushed enter. Divide by 5, pushed enter. So now this is the decimal that actually stands for. And when I go into my calculator and do second sine, remember cut and paste, so second answer will do the same thing. And we end up with our same answer. So there's a workaround with all of that, but again, if you do the radical, because we don't want to go through all the steps to get the decimal, make sure you have enough parentheses. Again, just practice finding. Now this time we changed gears because we're going to go into 9-6. So the way we introduced it, it's the sections are opposite in Knowre. So now don't get confused. We're not finding angle measures, we're finding side lengths. Process will still be the same. Find your reference angle. Make sure that you look at what everything is labeled. And we want RS. We want to use 10 because that's the only other value they gave us. So adjacent and hypotenuse are cosine. So we write cosine 45 equals adjacent over hypotenuse. Now I will tell you that obviously this is a special right triangle. The only reason I'm not using our special right formula is because it says specifically to round. So they don't want a radical answer. They don't want the 5 radical 2 that this would end up coming up to be. They want that decimal. But let's just talk about that. If they want that to the nearest hundredth, you can go through the steps on your calculator. You could do cosine 45 and you'll get that value. You could write all that out and go through your proportion steps to cross multiply, and we would end up with RS is about 7.07. And you can plug that in. Or if you recognized that this is a special right, A, and A radical 2, you could go through the steps just like we did before, divide both sides by radical 2, and because it says give the decimal, 10 divided by radical 2 will give you the exact answer that we already knew. So you have a different way to do it if you wanted to. And that's only because it falls into that special right category. Either way, they want it rounded. So I thought that one was interesting just because of the way that happened to be a 45-degree angle. And see, wasn't that bad. 4 pages went pretty quick. Next one, pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Let's just find again the length of AS. We have our reference angle, opposite, and hypotenuse are the only ones we really care about here. And that is sine, because the definition is opposite over hypotenuse. So sine of our angle 34 is opposite over AS. So here's why I always like to do the ratio, because it does come in handy here where it's not just a quick multiply and I'm done. I'm concentrating on it's a proportion. We're going to cross multiply, and that means we still have one step left because now it's 1 times 4. So when we do solve, we are going to have to divide both sides by that crazy decimal. And we end up with, again, using this cut and paste. That second answer is going to come in handy. So 4 divided by second answer, and now we'll get a much closer rounded than we would have before. And I do believe if we did 4 divided by, because aren't we really dividing by sine 34? You end up with the same thing. So just something to think about depending upon how comfortable you are with the calculator and the process. All right. So last of our interesting Knowre questions, just so that we don't have as many issues, it says using only the given measures, find the missing lengths and angles. So we talked on Wednesday that anytime it says find the missing lengths and angle measures, this is a very long way to say solve the right triangle. So we did talk about the directions could simply say solve the right triangle. So we already have this set up, and we want to find the angle measures and we want to find all the missing sides. So Pythagorean theorem is going to be the easiest for AS. If we double check, it would have been nice if this was 15 and 20, and then we know that side because it's a 3, 4, 5. But it's not, so we need to probably, let's work with our angle measures first. That seems to be the smartest thing. I'll start with A, and we have our adjacent side and our opposite side, and that makes tangent. So tangent A is opposite over adjacent. We know in order to find angle A, we're going to do the inverse tangent in our calculator. And so A is going to be approximately inverse tangent of 25 divided by 15. It's going to end up being 59.04. It rounds up. And when I go to find angle S, That's going to be 90 minus 59.04. And so angle S is going to be about 30.96 degrees. So part of our answer is finished, but we still need to figure out that last part, and that's our Pythagorean theorem. So 15 squared plus 25 squared will equal AS squared. That comes out to be 850 equals AS squared. Now, ironically, if we were to break this down to see if there was any perfect squares in here, one of the things I did was I just checked again. I know that says 85, but I just did 85 divided by 5 was 17. What I also noticed, though, is I didn't do a 10. Well, if I took 850 then and checked 25, because 10 has two factors of 2 and 5, I end up with 25 times 34, and the only factors of 34 are 2 and 17. So those prime numbers kind of tell me I'm stopping right there at 34. So when I take the square root of 850, if I have to, 850 will break down into the square root of 25 and the square root of 34. So my answer is 5 radical 34 is equal to AS. So that's what we've grown accustomed to doing. It says round all values to the hundredths. So right away, you can take the square root of 850 and again make sure that you are rounding, and it does stay at 29.15. So make sure that you read your directions so that you don't get caught up in what we have truly up to this point gotten very accustomed to plugging in, and that's those exact values. Now that they're saying all values should be rounded, that one's going to be the acceptable one. So I went through and I was looking at what were good review questions, but also making sure that we didn't get caught up too much in what the directions were asking. So be careful with that. So quite a few examples. Want to make sure that if you have any other questions that you ask, you will notice that last night I loaded into Google Classroom your assignments, your notes, your information, and understand that you can definitely get started on 9.5, and you could pretty much get all the way through 9.6 pretty quickly. A lot of the questions were just, do you know the definitions? And that's all they're asking you for. Not until the very end of 9.6, I think it's the last 6 or 7 questions, will you get kind of held up on, because it's what we will talk about next week. So, does anybody have any questions or any comments before we finish for the day? All right. If you have questions, just email me and I will answer them as quickly as possible. And we will talk again on Monday. You guys have a great weekend. Oh, will we have to put in the unit when answering? I don't believe so. No. I did not on any of the ones that I answered, and I probably did probably 2/3 of both assignments, just to make sure. And I never had to put in the unit of measurement for any of them. So no, that's a good question. I get that even on here you can see that centimeters and inches. I think they already have it typed in for you. So no, you do not. And remember, all work, we have those benchmark dates. Please make sure you try to meet those dates. But if you have any questions about what you would consider late work, just keep emailing me and we will get those answered real quick. That way you're at least concentrating on getting work done and learning and not worrying about grades and that kind of stuff. So far you guys are all doing really well. Keep that up. All right, guys, have a great weekend. We will talk again on Monday.